Welcome to the county seat. We are privileged for this episode of the show to have our first one-on-one conversation with Congressman John Curtis, who's the former mayor of Provo, Utah, and now serves in our congression. You happen to be my congressman, by the way, so I'm glad that I'm well represented and had a chance to talk with you, constituent to elected official.
Excellent.
So I would like to, I think that a lot of people don't really understand your trajectory to the United States Congress. So let's walk backwards a little bit. Before Congress, you were? Mayor
of Provo, and I consider that the best gig in the world. I loved it. 8 years with Provo, and really good experience. And
well, apparently, because you had just a phenomenal approval rating, plus 90%. I mean, it's almost unheard of.
Yeah, but you know what I think of when I hear that?
What?
It's like, who are those 10%? And what are they thinking? And where did I go wrong? How do I win them over?
I can think of a whole bunch of mayors I know in the Salt Lake Valley that would just, die for even 2/3 of what you were able to. What do you attribute that to?
We had just a fabulous experience in the city of constituent involvement, of great growth in a positive way. For instance, in our downtown area, it was blighted and people felt unsafe down there, and now that's the heartbeat of the city. And a lot of really positive things happened. And I found as mayor, a little bit unlike Congress, everybody wanted me to be successful, and they were cheering for me, and it just turned into a really good relationship, one that I just dearly loved.
What was your background before mayor?
Before I was mayor, people really enjoy this in Washington, D.C., I was a partner in a company that built shooting ranges. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners are saying, what? Yes, we designed, manufactured and installed shooting ranges, large and small, not only across the country, but literally around the world. I've been on thousands of shooting ranges in many, many countries and in almost every state in the United States.
So the things where the targets move towards the...
We did those, the targets that turn. We did ballistic backstops, bullet traps, ballistic ceilings, stall walls. Really almost anything you'd find on a shooting range, we manufactured and installed.
Wow, that's impressive.
It was a fun business.
Well, let's turn our attention to your time in your, you're about a term and a half now.
I'm about 15 months. I'm feeling really experienced.
It's been a trial by fire. You've had a lot happen since the time you...
I was elected November 7th, sworn in November 13th, voted on tax reform 4 days later, and then immediately moved into the budget crisis and shutdowns. We've had 4 shutdowns since I've been there. We've been in the majority, now we're in the minority. It's been a packed 15 months.
Yeah, I'll bet. I figured we'd just take some issues across your district and start at the north and move our way downstream, and we'll just see how much time that consumes in our conversation. We'll have to take a couple of breaks in between to pay the bills. But I would like to start and talk about the water issues along the Wasatch Front. We're supposed to double our growth, and the current water structure in the mountains is not sufficient. And it usually means that there's going to be more protection, less access to the mountains that surround the Wasatch Front. What are your concerns, or what do you envision in handling those resources?
In many ways, I'm going to put on my old mayor's hat, almost more than my congressional hat, because I believe much of this has to do with local municipal planning, local city and county planning. I used to shake my head as the mayor of Provo at some of the other cities, how they were building out their cities, in many cases without regard to how they were going to provide critical infrastructure and water. And we've seen cities get pretty close to that line sometimes and had to issue restrictions, and yet at the same time they're issuing building permits and just letting their cities grow. In Utah County, we know we're going to double in the next 10 years. And some of the cities have the water for that and some don't. And I think there's a number of things we need to do, starting with municipal planning on a statewide basis, getting involved, and then, of course, dealing with issues on the federal level, like the Central Utah Water Project and things like that, to make sure we're maximizing every resource that we have.
There are a couple of issues that sit out there, though, that are going to be really important issues. One of them is if we put wilderness in to protect watershed along the Wasatch Front, how do we handle a storage problem? Because if you put wilderness area out there, there's not going to be any ability to create any more reservoirs or any more captures in that area. And so that would be issue number one.
Well, much of it is designated wilderness study. You've got to look really hard to find any designation moving back from wilderness study. You might find a few, 10,000 acres here and there, but in many regards, once it's designated wilderness study, game over for those storage projects. We're very fortunate that Utah has built some of those in the past and is ahead of that. But I think that's an issue, right, regardless. And so we're working on issues. Some people call it Mountain Accord. Some people call it Central Wasatch, CWC, Central Wasatch Commission, that is looking at those issues right now and possibly designated land use. And certainly as it comes to my office, which is starting to come my way right now, those are the questions that we'll be asking, among many.
Do you think there's any possibility that at some point we're going to have to look at it and say if we're going to have more people, we are going to have to alter landscapes and retain more water?
Well, yes, you're right if we're not asking the question, but it's not also just contained in that right there. We're seeing pipelines and things like that. We're reducing our water usage at a pretty good rate, not fast enough, but that's also issues of what can we do to consume less. And I'll come back to land use planning as one of the major issues dealing with all of this as well, that you can't just address one piece of this without looking at the whole landscape.
So some of the tribal leaders are beating the drum about possibly challenging water rights on the CUP, as you mentioned, that is a water source that feeds the Wasatch Front. What kind of impacts do you think that's going to have?
Well, significant. We have, in my district, we have the Navajo Reservation, and there's a water settlement bubbling up right now that I think...
All these puns that we just keep coming up with.
Water bubbling up, yeah. And, that's all washed out, right? And what we've seen with the Navajo water settlement is, I think, as good, open-minded people come together, we're actually able to find answers. This is supported by the state and the Navajo leadership. And I think we've got to be careful in our relationship with these tribes to make sure that we're finding a solution that really, truly is win-win.
So some of the problems may lie in the Ute tribe, which isn't part of your district, but the end result of the water that comes from there does end up in your district and feeds your district, and that challenge is maybe not going so smoothly. So how do you foresee that? I mean, what kind of impact does that have on your office?
Well, I'm smiling because you're absolutely right, especially a lot of these Native American issues. It doesn't matter if they're located in my district, there's impact. In some of these public land issues that we'll be talking about, we've seen that. I've traveled down to Arizona to meet with the Hopi Indians because it impacted Emory County. I've been out to the Utes because the impact was in Emory County. And so we're wise, but I must admit that this is Rob Bishop has taken the lead on this, so I don't understand the issue as deeply as I would if it were in my district. But I understand well enough to know that these are tough, and we've got to get ahead of them.
Well, man, you've set me up for our next round of questioning after the break because you keep going back to Emory County, and I know that there are a lot of people who watch this show.
Few things going on in Emory County.
Exactly. We'll take that up when we come back. We'll be right back on the county seat right after this break.
My daughter and I had just finished a run at this place called Eagle Point. It's this really cool but kind of challenging ski resort that has a real family feel to it. She was so excited because she beat me down the run. Deja vu. I saw myself as a kid out skiing my mom. It was a big moment for me. And all of a sudden it hit me. I was making the same memories for her.
Beaver County, Utah. Make it more than a vacation.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. Oh, reservation, skiing, starvation, that Duchesne County life.
All the traveling that I've done over the world, I'd still rate this locale as being one of the best.
This is some of the most scenic country out there. And part of the appeal for Kanab is it's a small town. It's beautiful. People are very friendly.
It's just been awe-inspiring.
You just couldn't find a nicer place to come.
There are meetings, and then there are gatherings. At the Davis Conference Center, we know the difference. Turn your event into something more than just another business summit. With over 70,000 square feet of flexible meeting space, state-of-the-art presentation amenities, and inspiring architecture, the Davis Conference Center is designed to deliver stellar results in a majestic setting. Take your convention to the next level. Schedule now at davisconferencecenter.com.
Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking with Congressman John Curtis, who has graced us with a half hour of uninterrupted time, and I appreciate it a great deal.
Oh, happy to be here.
I've run across you at a lot of meetings, but you're usually just so.
My wife would tell you the same thing at home. So.
Well, I'm glad that we have this time. Let's shift our gear to Emery County.
Yes.
You know, within the sphere of this show and other shows that I do, and the fact that I have the ear of a lot of recreation people. They're not very happy about the Emery County land bill, and they feel that that they lost out. What is your perspective on the broader picture, and what are some of the things that people need to know about this land bill?
Well, I'm glad you phrased it that way, because let me tell you and promise you, if they're not happy with this, they would have been far less happy. They would have been disgusted with the alternative. And that is not doing anything, because all that's doing is setting you up for Antiquities Act designation. And we saw in San Juan County what happens when a president comes in and does an Antiquities Act designation. It wipes out everything. We were able to preserve a tremendous amount for the off-road enthusiast. Clearly not as much as they would have liked, but far more, times 100, than had they been faced with an antiquities designation. And we tried at every turn to deliver what they wanted. We brought them in many, many conversations. They had far more influence on this bill than I think they would be willing to admit.
Or maybe that they realize.
Or that they realize. I think that's a good point. I also found that this community is a little fractured, and I don't mean in a bad way, just meaning there's lots of entities and lots of parts and pieces. So we would work with one, and not on purpose, but others wouldn't feel involved in what we were doing and discussing with them. But I can tell you unequivocally, the alternative was far, far worse for them.
Was there a lot of pressure from the environmental stakeholders in this entire process? That because I know that there were issues like no net loss was one of the things they were really hoping, so that what was cherry stemmed in and what was protected, that there was they don't feel like there's any certainty that those won't be encroached on going forward in the future.
Well, I would disagree with that. We feel like we brought great certainty to it. As a matter of fact, that was the whole purpose for doing this, is to take away that uncertainty that we would lose these roads. And I actually feel like they have far more certainty than they realize, or clearly that they would under other alternatives. And they need to remember too that they're one shareholder here. So we have ranchers, we have environmentalists, we have recreationalists that are not in the off-road vehicles. There's a lot of stakeholders here. And trust me, to bring this group together and find any consensus rarely happens. And we've seen that in San Juan County and in other places, that consensus of any level is difficult. And I wouldn't say that there was undue pressure from any one of these groups other than to try to find consensus. And because the lack of consensus, and I'll say this again, is far more problematic for every one of those groups. Not just one of them, but for every one of those groups. You watch and see, these issues don't get better. And I'm convinced that had we not done a bill now, and we tried to do this bill in 5 years or 10 years, the locals would have lost far more, by a factor of 10, because you watch every one of these, and those environmental forces only get stronger and more powerful. And you couple that with a presidency who wants to use the Antiquities Act, and you have a very dangerous situation. Let me just add to this right now, San Juan County, and I hope we have time to talk about that too, because it's far more problematic than what we've got in Emery County. We tried to put forward a solution there, and nobody wanted to listen to it, because on the one hand, they're saying not an acre of wilderness, right? We don't want to lose anything. On the other hand, they're saying we want President Obama's designation back, and we'll go to the courts and get it, or we'll wait for a new president. While all of that talk is going on, guess what Congress did? My Democratic colleagues introduced a bill that was 1.9 million acres instead of the 1.3 million acres in President Obama's Antiquities Act designation. Well, the Democrats have the House. If they get the presidency and a few more votes in the Senate, we're looking at 1.9 million acres in San Juan County.
And this would be congressionally designated?
Congressionally designated. Mm-hmm. So my point is as difficult as these are, we've got to find answers, or the alternatives are going to be worse.
So do you feel that moving from the status quo in Emery County, from massive wilderness study areas to wilderness, it is ratcheting down your options further? Is it more restrictive in wilderness as it is now written than it was in wilderness study?
Wilderness study and wilderness, there's really hardly any difference in use. The biggest problem was really not either of those designations. The biggest problem is what potentially could come on top of those, and that's primarily an Antiquities Act designation by a president who would come in and say, okay, this is all a national monument now. And sorry, you don't get any off-roading in a national monument. You don't get any climbing. I mean, there are, right, and so that's really what this, in many ways, was trying to prevent. Was the worst thing that could happen is that this all become a national monument. In
that 635,000 acres of wilderness area, are there any uses left other than wilderness protection?
Oh, absolutely. We've got the roads you mentioned that are
they're cherry-stemmed.
Cherry-stemmed, and we've got those. We worked hard, for instance, for climbers. One of the big issues, this will sound kind of trivial to a lot of people unless you're a climber, and that is they want to set their little pitons and use a drill, a power drill. Well, in wilderness or wilderness study, you can't do that. And we actually got a provision in the bill to allow them to do that. And this is what I mean by just the hours of tedious work that we did with all these stakeholders to find the issues that were just super important to them and try to bring it into this bill. That one issue is precedent setting for wilderness. We set a precedent which is really hard to do, because basically you've just put a little chink in wilderness and said now that door is open for every other wilderness area.
How did the grazers make out in this whole thing?
So we had specific land designated for grazing, and I do feel like that was a group that was listened to and got what they needed out of this, because that was also very important for us. And I'll tell you too that, wow, this is hard, right? I mean, making these decisions is super hard. And I just have full sympathy for the elected leaders in this county who had to navigate this. It was tough, and they're getting pulled, as you're hearing in a lot of sides. But I do congratulate them for this, having the vision to look ahead beyond today and decide what is best for their county. In 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, what is going to be best for their county? And that's truly how they were looking at this. If they were only concerned about re-election and this year, they would I don't know what they would have done. They may or may not have done the same things. But these are leaders who made hard decisions. And I'll tell you what, you look at any level of government and find a leader that's willing to make a hard decision, that's a valuable individual.
Okay, fair enough. There are two concerns. One of them is the buffer zone. Now there's talk about buffer zone. There's great concern that congressionally designated wilderness is now going to extend through Wayne County to follow the mesa all the way down to the tip. Is that?
So while I would certainly understand their concerns and sympathize with their concerns, these things don't just happen that way. And I know it feels like it does to them, but this is why you don't get public lands bills very often in Congress, is because these things don't move just simply like that. That's not the momentum that causes something to happen in an adjoining county. I would challenge them to show any precedent for where that was a problem. And so certainly understand their concern, but I wouldn't say, listen, don't worry about it, but I would also say it's just not the way that wilderness is designated. It's not the way that that legislation comes about, and in many ways, Emory's got to do what's best for Emory. Wayne's got to do what's best for Wayne. Certainly, that doesn't mean you don't take that into consideration. But I would, like I said, I'd challenge them to say, show me where this has been a problem across the whole country.
Okay. One last question. We'll take a break. We'll come back and we'll
go
on to San Juan County.
We need an hour version of the show.
Yeah, well, we can't afford that. Is there any way on that recreational community side that there might be an ability to revise down the road that might give them a little bit more of that no net loss protection in those cherry stem roots?
I think one of the things that we can do and are doing is we're putting into congressional record intent. So as agencies come along and try to interpret this later on, we're making sure that the intent of that legislation is in the congressional record. And I think that's one of the best things we can do to help them from that the worry that they have that something would come along in the future that would be problematic.
Excellent. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back and talk about San Juan County.
All right.
We'll be back with the county seat in just a second.
149 million years in the making, dinosaurs once roamed this land. Now they're found at the Dinosaur National Monument. Let's take you beyond the bones. We call it Dinosaur Land. You'll find it offers adventures and sights not seen anywhere else in the world. Come to Dinosaur Land, Vernal, Utah. You'll want to stay forever. The dinosaurs did.
In a place that is beyond words, there is nothing to be said, except take your time in Bryce Canyon country.
All local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover flavors you've never tasted and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own Discover Local Food.
In our world, the sun shines on high adventure, and new experiences are yours for the taking. And everything in you looking to play outside the box. Cedar City, it's time to play.
Utah has a national treasure where winding canyons stretch to the horizon, where nature forms elegant structures, and where iconic monuments of the West stand tall. Visitors around the world come to get a glimpse of southern Utah's legendary landscape and landmarks. Join them and explore San Juan County. Utah's Canyon Country.
The Utah Farm Bureau began as a collection of farmers supporting each other to raise the food we enjoy. Today, Farm Bureau membership encompasses everyone, whether ranchers, growers, or just everyday folks like you and me. Members enjoy discounts on items like vehicles and ATVs, or insurance that's very affordable. You don't have to be a farmer to join, and dues are small, but together we make a big difference in keeping our food supply local and abundant. Join Utah Farm Bureau.
Welcome back to the county seat, talking to Congressman John Curtis, and we are going over the counties of his district. We're going to move to the south now. San Juan County.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tough one.
You have a change in the winds blowing
yes.
governmentally in the county, and you now have a different feeling from the elected officials about how to handle this entire Bears Ears. We touched on it earlier. What do we do there?
Well, I'll tell you, this is one of the most difficult issues in my district, and the reason why is due to events of the past. There's just tremendous distrust on all sides, and that makes it very difficult to bring these groups together and to try to find resolution to these issues. Many are waiting for the lawsuits to run their course. Some are waiting for a new president to come and put the antiquities designation back in. There's actually a bill in Congress right now, which of course I oppose, but it would move it to 1.9 million acres of monument. And so my hope is that we can find a way to bring these diverse groups together to talk, because I think we can find a lot better solution than if we let it just run its course naturally.
And what sort of things would we be talking about in that solution?
Well, as I talk to people, this is kind of one of those issues where I think most people are not very far apart. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Most people agree that there are areas that absolutely should be preserved and protected. Some of the antiquities and some of the things in that area, nobody that I've talked to disputes that. There are areas where we should be able to recreate, and nobody really disputes that. There are some differences about extraction, and we'd have to come to terms with that. But if we could find the areas where we all agree and fundamentally get those in place, then all of a sudden these other areas seem easier to resolve. And it would be my hope that we can bring these groups together who do have kind of a history of not getting along and not trusting each other, and try to find the common good.
All right, well, I can guarantee you the show's going to get a lot of comments, so keep an eye on them, Congressman.
Okay.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for taking the time to join us on the county seat. Remember, local government is where your life happens. Be involved, be part of the solution, and we'll see you next week on the county seat.